This is a cool little whiskey and I helped make it. This week, let me tell you about the Lore Single Malt release from Element Whiskey. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and like I said, this is the Lore Single Malt Whiskey from Element. So let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now, first off, we're going to take a moment just to appreciate this bottle. I mean, the cork, the bottle, it's really like good looking bottle. Cork's a little hard to work with, but it's a really nice looking bottle. Got a lot of design work to it. I'm not going to go into the bottle because it's always what's inside that counts, but this is a really cool, distinctive bottle. It's got embossed names and stuff. Just a really cool bottle, but it's always what's inside that counts and how they're making the whiskey, because Element are doing something a little bit different than a normal whiskey brand. They are not making their own whiskey, they are sourcing their whiskey. This is coming from the Great Northern Distillery and it is single malt whiskey made by the Great Northern Distillery. But what they're doing is they're doing what they call open innovation. Open innovation is, to cut a long story kind of short, essentially it's crowdsourcing the whiskey. What flavors you want in the whiskey, what kind of profiles you want in the whiskey. They take feedback from customers, from drinkers, and they incorporate that into their whiskey, which means these releases might change and evolve over time. This is the release 1.0, so I imagine in future there might be a 1.1, 1.2, and the flavors might evolve over time. So how does this process work and how did I help make this whiskey? Well, on their website, I'll leave a link to it down below. I'm not affiliated with them at all. I just think it's a really cool idea. I'll leave a link to it down below. You can kind of sign up to be part of their, I guess, community where they will get ideas from you on how to taste the whiskey or how to blend different whiskeys together. So what they did was they sent out me a couple of samples of different whiskeys, all single malt, all at 43% and all around 4 years old. They were all aged in bourbon whiskey, but three of the kind of samples were finished in different types of wine cask. One was finished in Marsala, one was finished in Madeira, and one was finished in Moscatel wines. And what they did was they had us kind of taste these whiskeys, get to know the kind of flavors in them, and then make different blends with the whiskeys to try and create a good harmonious flavor profile. I have my little notebook here from the time of when I had my different notes and different kind of flavors and I made different blends, and kind of from the time when I was tasting it, the kind of bourbon cask matured was sweet, pear drops, really nice icing sugar. We thought the Marsala wine cask was a bit fruity with blackberries, apples, but it felt a little bit like hot in the glass and had this kind of forest floor note that we didn't really love. We thought the Moscatel had this nice berried note, but also hard candies, honey, banana, pudding, this kind of nice fruitiness. And the Madeira wine cask had this kind of rich, oily, oaky, malty kind of note to it. It had the nuttiness. We thought that was really nice, but that it might dominate a blend if you use too much of it. So in our feedback, we kind of said maybe use only a small amount of that. And well, they might have taken my feedback or our feedback on board, because in this blend, there is none of that Marsala wine cask. It actually is just a blend using the bourbon that was aged and lived its whole life in bourbon, as well as some that was in the Moscatel and the Madeira wine cask. So the blend didn't use any of that whiskey that we thought wasn't great. Now, maybe other people had the same notes, maybe other people had different notes, but either way, I contributed to the making of this whiskey. So I'm gonna say I made this whiskey, even though I honestly didn't really make the whiskey. Like I said, this is a 4-year-old single malt whiskey coming from Great Northern Distillery, coming in at 43% alcohol by volume. It was likely chill filtered because it's coming in at 43%, but let's go in for the nose and see how it is. Cheers. Okay, immediately, it's really fruity. It's really like bright, fresh fruits. Like I'm getting a nice rich, not like a green apple, but like a Fuji apple or like a Braeburn apple, where it's got that kind of crunchy, sweet apple note, rather than being like that tart, bitter green apple, like that fruity, crunchy red apple note. There's also a nice bit of like Moscatel wine. Like Moscatel wine, it's nice, it's bright, it's fruity, it's fresh. It's a really sweet wine, and that has, I think, come through a lot here. There's a nice bit of this kind of like, almost like honeyed, creamy note that's just kind of rounding out. Kind of like if you take an apple slice and you dip it in a bit of honey, that's the kind of note, where it's got this nice sweetness, but also this kind of wrapper of kind of, you know, also sweetness, but rather than fruity sweetness, it's like a sugary sweetness around it. There's a nice bit of like malted barley note. Obviously it's a single malt, you're going to get that malted barley note, but as well as that, there's a little bit of like a lemon peel, that lemon citrus note coming through, a touch of oak. Like it is quite a light, you know, it's not super deep, it is only 4 years old. It's not the super heavy, deep kind of nose, but like it's got that nice balance of the wine influence, the malt influence, the bit of bourbon, vanilla sweetness, maybe not fully there, but just like a little kind of a baseline underneath there. But it's a nice, very easy to nose. Like they say that they're making whiskey for whiskey drinkers by whiskey drinkers, and this is a very easy and enjoyable whiskey to nose. But let's go in for the palate on the whiskey. Cheers. That is very, very fruity. Like there's much more vanilla, I think, on the palate than in the nose. The nose, it might have been there as a background flavor. Here in the palate, much more up front. There's vanilla, there's caramel, there's more of that oak, and again that fruitiness from the wine is definitely coming through. The mouthfeel is kind of between honey and cream. Like it's got this kind of creaminess, but like that almost stickiness that you would expect from like a honey, you know, honey. So it's got that kind of mouthfeel that's not super heavy, not super sticky, but it's nice and kind of rich. On the fruitiness, I think I'm gonna go in for a second sip, see if I can isolate what those fruits are. Definitely a bit of apple, definitely a bit of grape, but see if I can get more detail. Cheers. There's still citrus on the whiskey and there's still apple, but I think on the nose it was much more apple, a little bit of grape. On the palate, a little bit of apple, much more of that grape, much more of that oak, that kind of wine characteristic influence is definitely coming through into the whiskey on the palate when I'm tasting it. There's a little bit of peppery spice, there's a little bit of like cinnamony spice maybe coming through from that oak, but it's very nice, very sweet at 43%. It's not super high, but it is coming in with a fair bit of flavor for something at 43%. I can feel the kind of the finish going now, so I'm going to go in for a final sip, talk about the finish. Cheers. Okay, on the finish, up front you get your fruitiness, you get your kind of honeyed notes. Those kind of fade off a little bit, leaving like that peppery, oaky, vanilla spice I was getting. It's almost a little bit like a coffee, like when you get that coffee has a little bit of like bitterness, but rounded out with that vanilla cream. Like their official tasting notes say like a cafe latte. I think maybe not like a full cafe latte where it's a lot of milk, maybe like a little bit of milk, a little bit of creamy kind of sweet milk into a coffee. You still get that bit of bitterness, but you also get that kind of rich, creamy wrapper coming around it. And as I'm talking, as I'm kind of leaving it here, as I'm breathing it, that nuttiness is coming through, kind of like a hazelnut cream, like a hazelnut kind of pudding or dessert, where I've had things like that before, where it's this kind of creamy hazelnut custard, and that feeling I'm getting here as I'm breathing, as I'm talking, I'm getting more of that pronounced hazelnut note and less of like those sweet fruity notes that I was getting in the palate. So it does have a nice bit of a change, and it does linger, I'd say, fairly long. I've had whiskeys that just fall off immediately as you taste it. This is lingering nicely into the finish. One thing I'll say about the price on this whiskey, because it does come in at €65, that is fairly high. Like in that range you're getting into like some kind of more high-end premium Irish whiskeys. Now granted, this is a very nice whiskey, and I expect that there's a lot of cost in making this whiskey, because with the sending out samples to people, getting feedback, running the tasting, collating the feedback, and then getting the whiskey, blending it together to kind of match up with the feedback, that's probably a costly kind of labor intensive process. So I can see where some of the price is going, as well as maybe for this like admittedly really distinctive but probably costly bottle. But €65 is expensive, but it is a very nice whiskey. I think this idea of getting feedback from people, getting kind of the crowdsource, getting the, as they call it, open innovation, but crowdsourcing your tasting notes, crowdsourcing the kind of whiskeys that people want to make, people want to drink, is a good idea, and I do hope they continue in future. I know they've got an idea, I think they've got a single grain release coming out this year in 2024. I was on the tasting panel for that one. Like I said, check out that link below if you want to be on the tasting panel for their next whiskies, because it's a really kind of fun idea. You get to taste whiskies, you get to kind of get a sense of what's coming down the line, and when it's released you can kind of see how your kind of taste notes compared to the final product. But that's probably all I have to say about the Element Lore single malt whiskey. If you have ever tried anything from Element, let me know down below. Or if you've got any kind of ideas about ways the whiskey industry can innovate, let me know down below. I put out whiskey reviews on Wednesdays. I put out cocktail recipes on Fridays featuring whiskey. So if you want to see those, make sure you hit subscribe, hit that thumbs up button, and I'll see you next time. Sláinte.